and welcome to MMA Life TV. UFC Fight Night, Anthony the Lionheart Smith versus Glover Teixeira. An interesting card, a really good one for that fact of a matter, but a really interesting fight. Now, the light heavyweight division is in flux, and when I say this, it's a very interesting time. I mean, at the top of the ladder, we've had, for the longest of time, Jon Jones. And who will really dethrone Jon Jones? Wait a second, mate. Didn't Dominic Reyes beat Jon Jones? Now, that's a whole debate for another time. But look, it's in a matter of flux in the sense that we don't necessarily, apart from Reyes, have a pipeline of contenders coming through. So when I first heard about, Teixeira versus Anthony Smith, it's like, what's the purpose of this fight? Well, Glover is coming off a 3-fight winning streak. Anthony Smith coming off a winning streak of his own. So really, this is a jostling position. This is like putting your hat in the ring and saying, we're next here. So look, it's interesting. Both fighters are at different spectrums of their career in terms of age. Glover, an elder statesman, he kind of looks like an ethnic Dana White, if you ask me. And there was an interesting scene when he was chatting with Dana White after the fight. Let's just say that they're both going for the same look, i.e. the white bold look. The short of it is, look, it was an interesting fight. Let's get to the fight itself because there's a lot to unpack that move just past the fight itself. Anthony Smith comes out aggressive, and what's really been prominent in these the last couple of UFCs is without a crowd, it's very apparent that the cornermen and actually the commentators, the fighters are very weary, and I can actually hear what's happening here. So this is a twofold consideration because if a commentator is generating an insight, you can actually listen to what they're saying and potentially adjust your game plan on the fly. So that's one interesting element. The other thing is usually, and we saw the good part of this in terms of Justin Gaethje really listening to his coach, and this was because his coach was giving him fantastic advice. Now there have been commentary about the advice given on the corner for Anthony Lionheart Smith. So the short of it is, the first round they come in, there's definitely a striking output advantage to Anthony Smith, and they're both touching each other up. But seemingly, while in the early exchanges, which are all fought in the pocket, Anthony is generating a strong level of output. Let's put it there. And in the commentary, we actually hear Daniel Cormier say that it's too much. Now, I thought this to be quite an interesting comment because, look, there's no doubt that when you think of the different sort of weight divisions, depending on how you like to watch the fights and the aesthetic that you're after, people like stand-up wars, right? So while in the heavyweight area, weight classes, obviously we saw Ben Rothwell and Ovin St. Preux, the big lumbering guys. You have really dynamic strikers such as Francis Ngannou, but he's a dime a dozen, and he's really an apex striker when you think of the entire UFC sort of roster in that particular regard. So he's an outlier. But the weight class that you fight in really determines the level of output and the fighting styles that you see. I mean, the flyweights and the featherweights can generate a lot of output. They're like Energizer bunnies. It often makes for a very sort of aesthetically exciting fight. Light heavyweight is kind of interesting. And the reason I say that is there are a lot of strikes that are underutilized in MMA and in the UFC. And the uppercut is definitely one of them. In boxing, it's a very... It's definitely a much more used strike. But in the UFC, you don't see that often. But wow, you saw that a lot in this fight. And again, I'll unpack how Glover Teixeira used this to maximum impact. And effectively, it was the strike that won him the fight. But look, initially, Anthony Smith comes out with, a lot of jabs, pumping a lot of combinations and crosses, and really winning the striking regard in that really winning the striking war in that particular regard. I think what's interesting is Glover was taking the punches and swinging with it, not necessarily taking it. So while there was a level of damage that he did sustain over the course of the first round, and definitely the second round, you could see in his eyelids, it wasn't major, right? So towards the back end of the second round, we actually see similar sort of engagements. And what's interesting is Glover Teixeira would corner Anthony Smith and unload with really cool sort of combinations. But towards the back end of the second round, you saw the output of Anthony Smith kind of wane a little bit. And it was quite apparent that be it from a cardio perspective or something, he was slowing down in that particular regard. And this is where, interestingly enough, the observations made by DC earlier in the fight kind of actually played into fruition, in that he was slowing down, but it was relatively even at that particular point. So now we're entering the third round. Again, they meet in the octagon, and you see Anthony Smith a bit more labored in his punches, but still getting the requisite output. And this is where, to me, towards the back end of the third round, the first and really most decisive strike, which basically spelled the end of this fight, occurred, in which Glover Teixeira, in the midst of an interchange, caught Anthony with a uppercut. Now, what's really interesting is, again, I haven't seen a lot of really strong executions of uppercuts in the UFC, and it's a very interesting strike because usually in boxing it's used to great effect, with the body blows and that, right? Here, how this kind of executed was, within the course of one of the interchanges, I think Anthony Smith was covering up, and it almost occurred in slow motion. And again, here it's because he had kind of lost his way in the energy management component. He was covering himself up and actually putting his hand down, and he walked straight into an uppercut, which, even when you saw it on replay, didn't look that kind of impressive in that particular regard, but it really wobbled and shook Anthony Smith. And really, it was built upon that uppercut that we see Glover Teixeira come and really swarm him, put him against the cage, and really unload it. And the great thing about Glover is, when he was against a cage, he showed a real ability to mix it up in terms of strikes, to the body, and really hurt Anthony Smith. So by this time, at the conclusion of the third round, Anthony Smith was in a whole world of pain. Fourth round comes in, and Anthony Smith is definitely not himself. Glover Teixeira just keeps going to work. And again, it just seemed like at that case, his gas tank had been spent. He gets Anthony Smith against the cage. Brilliant interchange. And again, you got to know, at this point, there were other uppercuts that had initiated. And again, it just seems very slow. When you think about the machination and the execution of how an uppercut occurs in a fight, usually within a boxing connotation, you're digging kind of in. But again, these uppercuts occurred in the face. So twofold, if you think of these individuals as having relatively similar sort of height, it's either you're bending down to hit, or you're bending down, you're bending down to hit, right? No matter what sort of execution. But interestingly enough, Glover Teixeira was able to get this on Anthony Smith's face quite frequently. And it was because of the labored sort of blocks or lack of blocking that Anthony Smith was doing. And I think really, again, tying to the weight classes, when we see the sort of boxing executions that are in heavyweight versus lightweight, versus light heavyweight, they're very different. You see really crisp movements, and it's not that you don't see it in the heavier weight classes, but again, just akin to the sort of execution of an uppercut that you would have in a lower weight class. It was really interesting. I guess I didn't see a lot of rather defense in that particular regard by Anthony Smith. And not for lack of trying, because Glover was quite sharp on the hands. I mean, he's a big burly bloke, and he's booked there. So there was an exchange in the fourth round where Glover has Anthony against the cage. And again, when he was against the cage, this is when Glover did some of his best work from a boxing perspective, really ripping into Anthony and unloading. And at this point, you could really tell that not that Anthony Smith was quitting, but he was there. Like, he was on his last legs. Interestingly enough, Glover did a level change and took Anthony Smith down. And now, at that time, he had a fair amount of criticism from John Anik, saying that, he had a lot of success in the feet. Why would you take Anthony down? But there was decent levels of ground and pound. And really interestingly enough, and it wasn't until the end of this fight where you saw this. At this point in time, somewhere within here, Anthony Lionheart Smith actually loses some of his teeth. And while getting impounded at the ground, gives it to the ref. Now, this is amazing. It's actually freaking amazing. And I'm not too sure if it happened in the fourth or the fifth, but you can actually visibly hear Glover Teixeira and Anthony Smith having a conversation. And Glover saying something to the effect that, sorry, mate, I don't want to hurt you. Something to this effect. It just is the game. And Anthony's saying, all good, buddy. I understand. Again, not exactly those words, but to that effect. I mean, that's amazing. That's actually amazing to hear that sort of interchange. And something you definitely would not hear if the crowd was there. It really creates a sort of interesting dynamic. So by the end of the fourth round, Anthony Smith is lying down there and he is getting absolutely impounded. In fact, in one of his ears, he has cauliflower's ears, he's getting beaten at the eardrum and it's actually pulsating, bleeding out. So Anthony Smith goes into the corner of his corner on the fourth round, moving to the fifth, and tells his corner that my teeth is broken. He tells the corner that his teeth is broken. He doesn't want to fight. He did not look like he wanted to fight. And instead, what he's greeted with is a corner that's telling him, you don't want to lose this round. Give it all. Something to that effect. And this was really interesting to watch. You could just tell as Anthony Smith was getting up, he did not want to go there. He definitely didn't want that fifth round. And the short of it is they get released. They meet in the center of the octagon. Glover pushes him back with some strikes. Anthony Smith offers little to no resistance. By this time, he has given the cues that he does not want to fight. He is out. I'm out. I have checked out. Not mentally, but physically. I have been beaten up in the 2 rounds prior, really convincingly. I think there were sort of 10-8 rounds in that particular regard. So interesting, right? Really interesting to see that. Glover gets on top, takes him down, ground and pounds him, and it was over. It was over. So, look, it was a very interesting sort of fight. A couple of considerations here, and the thing that had been doing the rounds was just a lot of things. You saw a very genuine exchange by 2 fighters, extremely respectful, and here to show just how these athletes at the highest level, physically, mentally, and had an honor sort of system. That was just amazing to hear and see that exchange. But secondly, it just seemed like Anthony's team was really disconnected from him, the fighter. And it's really interesting because obviously there's vested interest between the fighter and the corner to get them to perform at the highest level. And these 2 parties, act in unison. There's no doubt. And you see it time and time again when a fighter wins a fight or gets a sort of championship, they dedicate a large portion of it to their corner and their camp, and absolutely, as they should. We saw Justin Gaethje have an amazing engagement with his coach, and essentially that, like, following those orders really got him to where he is now. He was not getting that. He was not getting that from his camp. It's really interesting because in between rounds, you want one of 2 things. One, you want motivation, assurance, or tactical advice. And it seemed from every level of it, Anthony Smith was not getting it. It felt like there was a lot of output. Output's good, but constructive output's kind of what you need. And there was just a lack of empathy. Fighters are gonna, you hear this time and time again, fall on their shield. And essentially that's what happened to Anthony Lionheart Smith. I mean, he's headlining a card. He's not going to say he quit. I mean, that era, I mean, the shame that a fighter would feel would be insane. Essentially what I'm saying is that a corner needs to see that happening and take that bullet on behalf of the fighter. You need to put them out of their misery. You need to say that, look, mate, you can't, I'm going to make this decision for you if you're not going to. You've been beaten up. Sure, there is a propensity that you could potentially win it. But in the long term, the humiliation or the propensity to take a really fatal strike or one that can have lasting impact is probably worth more. At the end of the day, these are human beings, right? Like, take them as assets, take them as whatever you want to. Those decisions needed to be made, and I felt that there was a real lack of empathy, or more, there was just a disconnect between fighter and camp. And the end goal, which was winning this fight, kind of really overtook it at all costs. So yeah, look, really interesting fight. We saw a lot of interesting things. As for the light heavyweight division, I mean, Glover wins it. Really interesting. I saw the press conference between Dana White and potentially, it seems like John Jones and Jan Blachowicz, I can't even pronounce that name, by the way, is the fight that's going to happen. But they're talking about Glover Teixeira and Dom Reyes. Man, Dom's going to be spewing on that one. Look, it's interesting. Again, there's not a lot of fresh young blood there. And interestingly enough, while this fight, the heavyweight fight rather, was happening between Ovince St. Preux and Ben Rothwell, John Jones was tweeting and giving his thoughts on it, and it incurred the wrath of one Francis Ngannou. The wrath. I'm stirring shit up. It incurred commentary there, so it's interesting to see where his headspace is at. But you know what? It's amazing to see the UFC back in action. It'll be interesting to see how Anthony Smith bounces back from this. I've no doubt he will, but he's got to make some decisions because he got damaged. I think he had an orbital structure bone. He had 2 teeth knocked out. It's going to take some recovering this, like from a mental perspective, and there's no doubt that we don't operate in a vacuum. Him and his team are going to hear the criticism of his team, rather from a strategic perspective and just from a perspective of taking care of him. They're going to hear it. It's out in the media already. I'm just saying what I'm thinking and what's kind of been reported out there. But yeah, really interesting. Again, guys, thanks for listening to this little recap. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Give us a like, show us some support, and talk soon. Peace.